But now everyone understands. You got some picture in mind, surely. Me talking about merry-go-rounds in the past, and then pointing out that things go in a spiral. Now, before me talking about a merry-go-round once or twice, throughout history, life has had some people saying things like, what goes around comes around, there's nothing new, or everything that's new is old again, and then everything that's old is new again. But even things that seem to be repeated, even things that I seem to go back for, even if it takes me just 2 or 3 nights, I go back and say I'm going to continue something or to expand upon it, try to get you to widen your sight, if it's that or whether it's several years later. I do not simply go back to repeat. I do not engage in reruns. If anybody's ever thought that, is not in some way that I suddenly driving down here and go, Jesus, boy, I don't have any material tonight. I can't think of anything. You know, in case any of you's ever wondered, that's not the problem. If I was actually in some way dealing with setting up material, I'd have notebooks. If I keep some kind of track, it'd just be, I'd look at it and get the blues. I'd think, well, if that's all has any validity then and should be said to somebody interested, then my God, I'll never get around to it. So the point is, it's like a spiral. Looking at merry-go-rounds, I used to say running up a worm screw, but if we're just cutting out a paper in a circle, and then of course cut it at one spot, two-dimensionally in the vertical plane, the horizontal plane I mean, and then you got the spiral. And of course by now you've had your own experience yourself that you've thought things, whether you thought you got them from me or not, but you thought something and it was meaningful. And then at some time later you went, and it's like, well, I understand it more. All right. Several areas that I had changed some of the terminology on and brought them up in a different context over the last few nights, and some of it I might use some of the old terminology, but you should be able to sharpen your intellectual sight now and see if you can't see this in a much more subtle way, because this is again getting way out to the floodplain where the inner waters of a continent begin to run into the ocean itself. The purpose of that metaphor was this gets into the areas that everything, salt and fresh water, it all gets so intertwined, and it gets down to like estuaries to where you won't drown. It just might be up to your toes or your ankles, but it's stretched way, way out, thousands of acres like the Everglades or the Okefenokee. You don't have to drown in it. It's getting closer to where everything is all stuck together, where things make sense, but they make sense at such a subtle level that people looking for mystical statements and great mysterious truths, they go pumping about and hollering, where is it, where is it? And all they think is, well, I'm getting my shoes muddy. But I'm looking, what I want to do is drown. And you miss it. But you can miss it. All right, here it is. I'm going back and talk about resistance. But I won't try tonight, I believe, but now I can try getting another way that some of you may begin to see. Resistance, simply a word. There is a reality going on. It is more like a very subtle adversarial arrangement in life. It is not resistance based upon human personality, although it can be described that way if you've got to describe it on a kindergarten level, if that was all we were doing. But it permeates everything, and it is not necessarily, as I hope some of you will begin to see, it is not necessarily obvious at all what's going on, much less to be labeled anything resembling resistance. Let me give an example that's got 4 or 5 different little potholes in it that you can stop, and I can drag out examples. But in the ordinary world, in the three-dimensional world, there is a kind of adversarial arrangement that is unseen. There's a kind of resistance always present that is not necessarily labeled or even thought about in any way having to do with a kind of resistance. And let me see if the scenario that came to me won't help some of you get a glimpse of this. Let's imagine a fella decides to buy up some property here, some wooded areas. The city's moving out, and he decides to build himself a little strip shopping center and make himself a little money. the obvious potholes, the obvious areas that I could hit upon. He's got to buy the property. He's got to get the permits, have the zoning changed, get the building permits. He's got to have the plans drawn up for the construction. And then he's got to go get his permanent financing at the bank, assuming he doesn't have all the cash, which he doesn't. So he's got to do all of this. I'll just leave it at those 4 examples. At all 4 of those examples, think about it right quick, you would have what apparently, by any reasonable, by any sane description, are ready, if not eager, participants. The seller of the property. Some guy sitting around there and he sees businesses moving out, and it's some old farmland, or it used to be 20 years ago that his grandfather left him, it wasn't worth $10 an acre, and now he's beginning to have dreams of $50,000, $75,000 an acre. Waiting, putting up signs perhaps, for sale, good architect, sitting around waiting for business. Somebody comes, say, draw me up a shopping center. The bureaucrats, I guess I'm pushing a little bit, but there they are paid to do the bidding of the public, they issue permits and etc. And so they're there. So we'll assume that they are at least ready to do their job, if not eager, to get the financing. What are banks in the business for? To lend out money to make a profit. Loan officers sitting there behind their desk with a big sign on the door saying loan officer, and they check it every now and then if nobody comes in to make sure the sign's still up. So you have people who are ready participants. But now, here's the subtle part. Anything going on in life that has a lifespan in human affairs over almost any discernible length of ordinary time. It's not just hit or miss. It's not just a spit in the wind. It's not just a passing comment of, hey, fellow, what time is it? I don't know. I don't have a watch. Okay. If it's anything past that, you're getting to where you have the reality behind this adversarial arrangement, this resistance. Think about it. It's never noticed. The guy calls, he looks up on the sign, the property for sale, this wooded area, calls so-and-so, eager to sell, good terms. Calls the guy and says, I'm interested, and the guy says, come right over. The guy that owns the property, come right over. And they sit down, and he says, I'm interested in the property. He says, I'm interested in selling it. He says, how much you want? And the guy says, I'd figure about $75,000 an acre. And let's say if the guy, the potential developer, was saying he might have to sell more. So you'd think, this thing's just going to go doodle-doo-doo-doo. Is it? No. No. Nobody knows why, but let's say that everything, the guy wants to sell, the A guy wants to sell, the big guy wants to buy. The A guy puts such and such price on it, the big guy's prepared to pay it. What else we got? We got 2 willing participants in this dance. But is that the way it will go? Now, if you're sophisticated beyond the area of the 2nd grade, you've got to think a minute and know in life. Now, don't strangle on my words like resistance, because both of them seem eager to do business. But will it happen without some sort of resistance going on? You've got to understand what I'm saying. No, it won't, and nobody knows why. But it will, or else the whole deal will blow up. They can agree. Do you want to sell? Yes. Do you want to buy? Yes. How much do you want? X amount. Are you prepared to pay that? Yes, I can pay that. And so you think, well, all it takes a handshake, then it will start. Do you hear me? It will. And I can start making it up. So the guy says, well, what kind of terms do you want to pay? And so the buyer says, well, I'm going to get permanent financing, just pay you cash after I give you a down payment. Let me make up that scenario. The guy will go, well, wait a minute, I'm going to check with my accountant about that, because I had a lot of money. I had some dividends and some more interest payments come in this year, and in fact, I think I'm going to have to check, because that, or I just turn it over. The guy says, what kind of arrangement do you have in mind? And the buyer says, well, it's going to cost me a lot of money to go in there and develop. I'm going to have to change the grade. I'm going to have to bring in some, we'll have to buy some dirt. You know how that land lays out there, yeah. And so I need to give you just the bare minimum, just the least amount of a down payment. And the guy says, well, I don't actually need a lot of money right now, but I had some more investments in mine. I'm going to check my account, because I'm not sure that I won't drag this out that long. Something will happen. I don't mean that we'll stop it. But it will not be, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. It will not. He can go see an architect. He says, I want to build a shopping center. Have you ever done it? The architect says, many. He says, well, are you free? He said, right now, come sit down. And he says, what I want is I have in mind about 120,000 square feet, and I'd like it on one story, and I'd like it either in a straight line, just a strip, or maybe an L shape, the way the property lies. Can you do that? The guy says, no problem. So you think, well, there it is, and he'll say, well, how much is it? And he'll write him a check. But the guy will say, well, all right, is it going to be facing east or west or north or south? And the guy said, well, the property sets on the main street is going to be facing south. And the architect starts saying, well, I've done a lot of these, and I do not like to do a one-story if it's going to be a literally stripped shopping center facing either south or west. I do not like the aesthetics of that. I can't do anything with the light. And so the guy buying the property thinks, light, schmite, you know, somebody bill me, you know, do the plans. Do you want the job or not? That kind, I'm just making it up. The bank, you would think, well, surely, the loan officer, the guy comes in, he says, I'm a legitimate businessman, you may have heard of me, such company. The loan officer says, yes, I have. He said, I got a new piece of property I'm about to buy, I want to build a shopping center, and I'm already worked out the plans, I've got the architect working on it, I've worked out the sale arrangement, what I need is some permanent financing, I got the down payment for the guy. The man says, have a seat. You're the kind of client we like. Is it going to be wham bam? No. Something will happen, and nobody knows what. I can start making it up, but surely you got the gist of it by now. Now, I do not mean that he will not get the loan. Do not mean that. But insofar as him walking in, any situation of him coming in, and I can build it up a little more, that he walks in, he says, my name's so-and-so, and I own such and such company. And the loan officer says, I know all about you. He can say, I borrowed money here last year to build a shopping center, and you can check, I paid everything right on time. The guy says, I know. I keep track of our great customers, and you're it. He said, I want to build a new one. He said, we couldn't be more delighted. He said, this time I only need X amount of $100,000. He said, no problem, sit down. But there will be a problem. It may be a small one. It may be something that they'll work out in a day or so. But do you hear me? Now I'm going somewhere else with this, if enough of you get it before I finish tonight. Resistance is not the correct word because there is no correct word or term in the city language to describe this. It is, the only word is life. But this has to do with a movement of energy that everybody can find something to learn about what has been going on in your life having to do with this. There will be, this adversarial arrangement will arise unless the whole deal is going to blow up. That is, this particular line, this movement of energy, is doomed fairly quickly to failure. That is, it's going to be a dead end. That is, the guy he'll get a little trouble, it'll seem like, from the buyer, from the seller of the property. And then you get a little problem from architects. Or then he hears some rumors that they're not, that the county, the locale where he is, the county is not all that in favor of rezoning in a quick manner anymore. So he may, and then he gets to the bank, and the bank says, well, blah, 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 we'll have to check with you in a few days. And suddenly this guy may go, and he wanders off to another part, or to the next county. That can happen. But even if it is going to be successful, that his dream, well, I should be able to get all this done and have the shopping center open by such and such month of next year, he may get it done by his original dream. So it makes sense, seem that on a 3D level, one guy had a dream, we'll buy this property, build a shopping center, get it going, blah, 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 X amount of time. And he may apparently do it. But from the time he planned it to the time that it opens its doors and it's rented out, there will be resistance in places that once I describe it, or anybody thinks about it, you would not expect. Not on the subtle level I'm talking about, such as from the guy wanting to sell the property, the current owner. I don't mean that there gets to be a problem that they won't pay enough. They apparently agree on all the major issues. That if I hadn't brought it out to you, you would think, when I say major issues, that they had agreed on everything. He looks up the man who owns the property and says, is it for sale? Yes, it is. How much do you want? X amount. I can handle that. That seems fair. And you just think, well, you know, it's a handshake away, or maybe they'll get an attorney to drop a sales agreement, but it's this close, and it's not. Try and look more keenly beyond any kind of word, such as resistance. It has to do with the physical movement of energy, and then it comes out in human affairs, but it comes out in ways that have never been seen correctly. When they are seen, manifestations of them, they are misseen. Insofar as it being useful, that is, it's diagnosed as avoidable conflict. It's seen as unnecessary infighting, wrangling over details, unexpected tripwires, and all of that is an indication of life through men at this level that this sort of thing should be avoided, can be overcome. Can it? Not now, not here in the 3D world. There is nothing in the ordinary world wrong with this kind of resistance. If, or unless, let me put it to you that way, there's nothing wrong with this kind of ordinary resistance unless you are seeking something beyond the ordinary. Because if you do not get beyond that, if you could not see it and can use this in a particular way that I may or may not try and point out specifically tonight, unless you can do this, then everything you do is going to be limited to being ordinary. That is, you can never do exactly what you dream to do. Or if you can apparently do it, it gets to be so much trouble that you think, Jesus Christ, I wish I'd started something else. Or even if you seem to get it done, somewhere between here and there, you suffer, as they say in the city, from acute stress. That is, it's no longer enjoyable. This is not as much fun. Well, next time, I either won't do it or you fall into this old trap. Well, at least, this was a hell of a mess this time, but at least I learned something. And it won't happen again, which of course it will, if you're going to be satisfied with the ordinary. Everything that happens, was that example enough? Your family, you fall in love. Let's talk about real Hollywood. Of course, let's talk about a first-class dose of lust. That you just walk in to a 7-Eleven, to a bar, and there she or he is. God Almighty! And you say a few words, and she just, as soon as she opens her mouth, you realize this is it. This is, oh. Your place or mine, whatever you'd like. It's just all going just like you asking for the loan, just like you asking, is the property for sale? Do you want to go do it? And she says, I thought you'd never ask. And it's just, you've seen each other for 5 seconds. And you say, you don't do it now. She says, I can hardly wait. And you say, well, your place or mine? And she says, well, if you're going to drive me crazy for talking, forget about it. And so, on the surface, again, apparently everything was going swimmingly well, no problem, but there will be a problem. It could be, all right, let me go past that little crude part. It could be almost, let's say when it's over the next day, that it seemed to be a night to remember. But you do know by now, don't you, that you say, your place or mine, she says, whatever you want, I'm the closest. And so you go there. But sometime, if you could analyze it, after the fact, you should be able to hear back in your own nervous system now, the ex post facto, the validity of what I'm saying, somewhere between you and the earth moving, and you guys just, balling it up and just having the time of your life and not to remember, somewhere within there was a form of resistance went on. There was an unsuspected adversarial arrangement arose. I don't mean that it seemed to interfere in the same way that the guy gets a shopping center built. But between the plan and between what seems to be the success of it, in there, it could have just been that she said, maybe her dog is giving trouble at the house, and you're ready to do it, and she has to take the dog out. And then she comes back in, and she says, and then she begins to take off her clothes, and she said, well, I hear him again. Well, he's been sick. Now, this may not stop anything when it's over the next day. You might say, well, I hardly remember that. But at the time you remember it, that is, at the time, it is an irritation. At the time, it seems to be a kind of resistance. At the time, if I suddenly jumped out from under the bed, don't ask me what I was doing under the bed. Everybody's got to be somewhere, all right? If I jumped out from under her bed while she went and took out the dog, and I said, all right, now this is the kind of thing I was talking about unexpected resistance. an unrecognized kind of adversarial arrangement that continually pops up in life. It's very subtle, but it's there. Then you might go, oh, well, yeah. But you wouldn't look at it like you would say, well, I don't think she's changed her mind or anything. She's still, her nose is open, she's panting, but her dog's sick. I don't, he doesn't feel good. And I'd say, I know that. And I could say, all right, if I'm smart enough to be under her bed and knew this was coming, I'm smart enough to tell the future, you're going to love tonight, everything will work out. But do you feel right now, can you think about what I'm saying, that things do not go directly as you thought? The loan officer says, well, you love to lend money. You're one of our best customers. You say, well, write me a check. And they go, well, we're going to let you know Thursday. And you say, what? It's always there. It is always there. It is the nature of there being a triaxial flow of forces at this level, observable. That's not the limit of it, that's not the scope of it, but there is that observable, the old three forces. Nothing can move in a straight line in the 3D world. And it's not because of evil, it's not because of inertia, it's not because of bad luck, it's not because of the fragility, if not stupidity, of humanity. It's because of life. There is no escape. And before I apparently try to move on a little bit, I will repeat, it is going on in such a way that you do not necessarily take any notice of it. You do not necessarily stop along the way, constantly go, well, gee, this is a small irritation. In the city nowadays, most people only seem to take intellectual notice of larger irritations. It's like life has got so many little ant stings, it takes a serious, like a big old fat 2.5-pound bee to get my attention. Now, I'm used to these small little slings and arrows. It takes big slings and arrows. But you're missing it. Just because you may not think about it, or just because I might have to jump out, or whether you can do it to yourself from under the bed or behind the bush and say, all right, right now, do you see what's going on? You went, yeah. The thought process, that is the highest point in your nervous system, has continual questions, complaints, beliefs within its own dialogue that things should be otherwise. Even at times that it is not labeling and thinking about what's going on as some serious form of resistance or even the potential of disaster here in this scenario or whatever activity you're doing. And yet the feeling is always there that bad luck, a little black cloud about to cry on me, bad luck, forces, little evil gnomes are hanging around, and it's always something. Even if it's just little old piss ants biting on me, it's always something. The tacit part is, again, that I should be immune from this. It should stop. Something should happen. This should go away. It ain't going away. It can't go away. All right? I got a couple that come to mind since I hadn't been doing any channeling for Kairoot lately. Or is it him doing for me? Somebody's supposed to remind me. Anyway, I've got some of them I have to bring out, and I'm going to use them tonight. I just say Kairoot's the sort of thing that he would have taken from me. The first act is always the best. That would have been a Kairoot. This is not all that can be said about it, but at the 3D level, from a revolutionary view, from a view somewhere straining against old intelligence, it's true. No, that's worse. It's correct. For those of you keeping track. And if you can't see that, at least it's true. That the first act is always the best. And along the lines that I am trying to push you tonight, I'm going to tell you one of the reasons that that is correct, to say that. The first act is always the best because immediately after the first act, you've got resistance and rewrite started. Immediately. That's as long as anything can withstand that kind of resistance. You can put resistance / criticism / rewrites and I'll drag them all in before I finish here in a few minutes. As soon as the first act is done with anything, and I don't care whose definition, who thinks it, that the first act is finished, the maximum time allowed will be the end of the first act. It can happen before the first act's over, but if I keep cutting it up so much, then we could never talk about anything. We can just barely talk about anything now, because I'd have to keep saying, well, well, well. Ad hoc, ad hoc. The first act is always the best, because as soon as it's over, at the very least, as soon as it's over, the resistance, the criticism comes in, the rewrites start immediately, at the very least, when the first act is over. There is a span at which time resistance does not three-dimensionally make itself known. From all ordinary views, though, almost nothing has happened in that first act. To wit. And I'm just going to start making it up because it can shift. The first act, there is no objective cutoff. But let's go back to the would-be developer going to the owner of the real estate in which he is interested. He can go in and say, are you the owner of that property on such and such street? And the guy can go, who wants to know? Right there can be the end of the first act. That is, the end of the first act was, hey, do you own that property at such and such intersection? And as it turns out, that can be the end of Act 1, because the guy goes, maybe, who wants to know? Or it could be, do you own the property at such and such place? And the guy goes, yeah. Are you interested? And the guy goes, well, I might be. So, from the other guy's view, the first act was that this stranger walks in and says, hi, I'm so-and-so. I want to know, do you own that property at such and such street? And I went, yeah, I do. It's for sale, yeah. And then from his view, that was the end of Act 1, because he says, why, do you want to buy it? And the guy says, no, I don't know, I might. Or, do I have to do much? The guy would come in and say, my name's such and such, I'm interested in that property on such and such corner. Do you own it? And the guy says, yes, I do. Are you interested in buying it? And he goes, yeah, I am. How much do you want? And the guy says, X amount an acre. All right, now let's shift back to the would-be buyer, developer. Now his first act is, he comes in and says, I'm interested in that property on such and such. Do you own it? And the guy says, yes. The first act's still going on. He says, yes. And he says, is it for sale? And the guy says, yes. The first act's still going on. He says, how much is it? And the owner says, such and such an acre. And that is considered that the would-be developer considers this. That's twice as much as he had in mind as a fair value for the property. So to him, now the first act has gone to that point. That is, the resistance has started. The criticism is coming in. Because in life, you do not have the historic, when things are done fairly, of a guy going out to review a play, or a woman, and actually seeing the play all the way through, and then going and writing it, and they publish it the next day at the earliest, the morning paper, waiting for the reviews to come in. It's not the way life works. The reviews start coming in. The criticism begins, the attempted rewrites. Now don't anybody fall into this, that you mean life makes the author, me, attempt to rewrite it. The rewrites start. Figure it out. They start after the first act. You don't have to wait for the morning paper to come out to find out what the kind of reviews you're going to get. They start after the first act. The resistance begins, the criticism, the reviews, the critiques come in after the first act. The first act is always the best. That's why I started this. If you begin to see it, the first act is the only act. If you begin to see it for yourself, then I'd point out the real revolutionists can leave almost anything after the first act. I would sincerely hope that some of you, without too much involvement from moi, could stretched out to almost the limits of Metaphorville. From reading a book, hearing somebody's idea, seeing somebody. The first act, once you know what you're doing, the first act's all it takes, because that's the only act. Do you know how much time you save with that? That you can read a whole book sometimes by reading the name on the book? Or maybe turn it over at the very least sometimes and read somebody's review of it. Or read the publisher's blurb about why you should buy it. Modern day version of Moby Dick. You know, I know all I need to know. Don't any of you people in the pro-Melville Society write me in all those postcards? The man was so good, why didn't he write shorter stuff? Push the limits of Metaphorville, because if you understand what you're doing, the first act is all you've got to see. Whether you're talking about a book, whether you're talking about hearing somebody's idea. How about hearing your own dialogue? I'm aware that here a lot of you think you heard something out of that, but I am going to have to push it one step further, for the part that you could easily overlook. You might as well leave after the first act, because as far as you're concerned, the first act is over as soon as you begin to resist it and criticize it. And as soon as you do that, you might as well put the book down. You might as well quit listening to the person anyway, because the play is over. You become a critic. So if you knew what you were doing in another sense, you would know that I might as well leave, because I've turned my brain off. I'm just sitting now, I might as well be watching TV. I might as well be trying to look up my own nose. The first act is the only act. That's it. Sometimes I like my own little segues and build-up, because I started out and I told you that the best act is the first act. But the truth is, the first act's the only act. That's everybody's play. After that, it goes somewhere else, no matter what apparently was the, if we could describe a pristine intention of the playwright, of the people doing this dance, of, hey, I want to buy a piece of property. Hey, I want to sell a piece of property. Well, you and I can get up and do a tango, and we can predict our steps right now. We'll just walk right over here. We'll walk right over to where you pick up the check or the permanent financing, and you hand it to me, and I hand you, the deed. We can see it right now. All we got to do is just go do-do-do, just 2 or 3 steps, right? They'll never get there. They may get to the point that they consider to be the fini of it. They may come to the conclusion that he sells the property and this guy buys it. But as far as we're going to step right here, we could paint it on the floor, we're going in this particular line, that's not going to happen. They would consider that the play amounts to, as quickly, as efficiently, as agreeably as possible, I will sell you this piece of property. And that guy says yes, and I will buy that piece of property from you. That will not be the full play. The first act will cease somewhere before that happens. The end result that they both dreamed of may come to pass. But the play as originally written, me doing it, me making it up, that all right, you and I are going to dance over here. It's going to take us 2 or 3 steps, 2 or 3 acts. We got to do that. But we'll end up right over there. They may end up over there, but they're not going in the direction. They're not going through the steps. They're not going at the tempo at which they dreamed of. Nothing does. For a reason. Now watch it. Are you ready for this? Let me ask you a question. This could have been a chi root. Is all speech for comparison? Second version, expanded version. Is all speech beyond the most basic statements such as I'm cold for comparison? Third variation is all speech, parentheses, beyond or even basic statements like I'm cold, for comparison. Consider. Nobody ever seemed to do much with this. I know I didn't give you much info, much encouragement, much impetus. And I've asked certain questions about the English language and even other languages. Consider. To what end? Consider the existence of the great buts, ands, ors, rathers, therefores, becauses. Start it back over. Is all speech for comparison. Variation 2. Is all speech, parentheses, beyond just the most basic statements such as I'm cold, into parentheses, for comparison. Third variation, Herschel listing 117. You know, if somebody'd get that man a better pair of shoes, he'd quit listing. Third variation is speech, parentheses, beyond or even the most basic statements such as I'm cold, into parentheses, for comparison. Has everybody got all that? The simple version is all speech for comparison. Is all speech beyond simple statements, basic statements, like I'm cold, 2 words, but I'm cold could be very important. The third variation is all speech beyond or even the most basic statements, I'm cold, for comparison. What else do people talk about? How many sentences are ever used, either overtly or in your own brain, that do not have a but, an and, an or, a because, or therefore? How many? How many people say anything from popes to presidents to your mother? How many simple statements are made? Now the third variation I gave you, use my example, if I'm cold, that's still a damn comparison. I hate to point it out to you. It doesn't have an and, it doesn't have a but, not an or in sight, there's no rathers, no becauses. It's just a simple, obviously straightforward statement, right? I'm cold. But wait a minute. Resistance. If a man's making a statement, I'm cold, you'd assume he's got some reason, like he wants somebody to help him get warmer. Turn up the heat, come lay down next to me. Could I borrow 3 or 4 of your dogs for the night? It is a statement to compare. He's saying I'm colder than I need to be. I'm colder than I want to be. Is there anything that people ever say that is not for comparison? Think about it a second. I'm behind on coffee. Think about it. Is anything ever said that is not for comparison? Anything? If ordinary intelligence did not compare, how would it think? How could it think about anything, if it were not comparing all the time it was thinking? Variation of that, how could people compare were it not for the dialogue? How could you compare if you did not have the possibility, whether you were aware that they are being exercised at that time, the 2 apparent voices, but how could you have how could you think about anything without comparing, and how could you compare unless you yourself, your dialogue, if I suddenly jumped out from your brain and I said, all right, here it is, and you say, well, I'm not comparing right now when I was thinking that, but you were, And you can say, all right, I see what you mean. There is always a tacit comparison of what I'm saying, because I was saying to myself, this guy went by, you dumbass, the way he pulled out in front of me. So you're right, I was saying dumbass compared to the way he should drive, or the way I would drive. And I can say, all right. But then you could say, no, not all right. Because I was not comparing, I was saying something actually happened. You saw the guy, he broke the law the way he pulled over here from one lane to another, making no signal. He was driving too fast. So it is not simply my inner dialogue comparing. I'm comparing the way things should be, or at least the way that the traffic laws of our state say they should be. And this guy jumped over 2 lanes of traffic with making no signal, plus he was speeding. And so my comparison does not derive from my own inner dialogue. Of course, I might say, God, you're a gabby sort. But I guess if I went to the trouble to jump out of your brain, I wouldn't get that simple. It is still arising from the dialogue because you're comparing. And it has nothing to do with the fact that you may think, well, the basis of my comparison arises out there, not I. Now, if you don't know better than that, but now, because what you're saying at a simplistic level could be true. That I'm not saying I didn't curse the guy. I was being crude by saying, well, you dumb mother. But what I was actually saying to the guy was, you're not driving correctly. People can't drive like that. It's against the law. Not only is it against the law, but if people did drive like that, it wouldn't be safe to drive. It wouldn't be safe for me. It wouldn't be safe for him. He would never get home. There'd be wrecks everywhere. So it is not some personal judgment on my part. I am dealing with reality and commenting on it. If you did not have the dialogue, you could not compare. If you could not compare, you could not think, period. You could not even think, I'm cold. You could be cold, but you could not say. Remember, I started off, this is about speech right now. You could be cold, but you could never say I'm cold unless the point of saying I'm cold was for the sake of comparison. You got to turn the tape over a sec. Well, you're going to get double subtle? Why not? This could have been a Kairoot, but it would have been so subtle I'm not sure whether I could even ever let Kairoot said this, but here it goes. Everything looks worse by comparison. We're good. Because that's it. That was the end of it. There is no more. I still guess it's a good thing I don't fool around and talk much in the city, because somebody in the city would say, well, that almost makes sense, except you got to say, you know, compared to what? No. It's everything looks worse by comparison. Big old fat period, that's it. Ooh, I almost got a chill from some of you. I'm almost tempted to drop it. You couldn't think were it not for comparisons. So anything you think about, you're going to compare it. Now back to my one-liner that opened this particular paragraph, is everything looks worse by comparison. Period. If you begin to glimpse that, all the possible questions, which are sane enough at the two-eyed thinking level, to say, well, what kind of comparison? You have to say compared to what? Because things could look worse, they could look better. No. Everything looks worse by comparison. Now, at least any of you think that I have already forgotten where tonight's tape started. Does anybody forget that? Think that because I say it? The kind of resistance I was talking about. The owner of the property, the would-be buyer. When the resistance starts, do you know that's another description for what I just said? That things seem to be going along quite well. Hello, do you own that property over there? Yes, I do. Is it for sale? Yes, it is. Somewhere in here, when the first act stops, when the resistance, although not normally seen as such, begins, you know what's happened? Another way to put it? That one of the parties, whoever believes that the resistance has started, whoever believes their first act is over, They never have any occasion. They could never find this out. And damn few people can even hear it talked about. What they have done is now made a comparison, and now the whole affair looks worse than it did. Because of what I told you, is that everything looks worse by comparison. And it doesn't matter what, but everything. The first act could be a split second that you look at something, an idea, a person. You look in your own brain at a possibility. Ah! And then as soon as you think about it in ordinary sense, you have compared it with something, and it immediately, to some degree that you can find, it looks worse. Well, I don't know. God, what an idea! That puppy's been sitting there. I'll buy it and build a shopping center. God! Wonder how much they want, though. Everything looks worse by comparison. And everything that the human nervous system says at the ordinary level is a form of comparison through which whatever the original, at that particular time we're cutting up reality, remember, and I'm making this a new act one of an apparently new play. Ah! What a great thing I just thought. What a great thing I just saw. What a great thing I just read. What a great possibility. And as soon as you think about it, you compare it. And as soon as you compare it, it suffers. Because everything looks worse by comparison. Now, at least you think anything's amiss. At least you think that we have escaped the estuary wherein the truth may be nibbling at your toenails and not much higher. But it's as far as the damn eye can see. The normal line of progress is fed by this. There is nothing whatsoever untoward going on. Because everything looking worse by comparison, I'm going to put it into 3D words and make it, you should be able to follow this, a linear map that fits right on reality. All apparent progress goes along this line. Somebody thinks about something. That is, life does it through a person, then a group of people. They think about something. They resist it. Maybe at first it's verbally, through criticism. They criticize it. Then they begin, if it's going any further, then they begin to expand upon their criticism. And then they do what? They begin to improve the motherfucker. It ends up going around a spiral, unless it's just going to fall in to a dead end, unless it just stops. But if it continues, it starts off as a person or a group of persons. They think about something that could have been going on a day, 100 years, a millennia, and they begin to compare it in a new way, to them at least. And then if this is going to take on much life, the criticism, the resistance, will sound new to other groups then, their contemporaries. That this is not, and they begin to criticize it. Verbal resistance, and then they begin to maybe physically resist it. We got to do something about this. We got to stop people from doing this. So we got to encourage people to do otherwise. They really find serious fault with it. It becomes a recognized worsening of the situation, except they don't see it through the worsening, that is, by comparison. They believe that we're now beginning to correctly, perhaps for the first time, to compare this. And it's much worse. We've let this thing go. Humanity has been pursuing this along whatever line it is, economic, politically, religiously, socially, but this has been going on, and people have not realized the damage that unemployment's doing, the damage that the lack of nutrition is doing. Something has got to be done about this, and they resist it. They criticize it. But then, if it's going to continue, I repeat, it can just stop there, and that's, nobody pays any attention. It's just one of life's little small breathing in and out, and it's just a flick, it's just a mash of a small little blackhead, a little bump, goot. But if it's going to continue, It moves from the criticism, but now when I said it was a straight line, you've got to see that when it ends up, you're going to be on another level. But it seems to move in this line that starts off as criticism. Shame, shame. It suffers by comparison. That is, if not comparison by something else extant, it suffers by comparison that suddenly some person or person's nervous system say, all right, this is not right compared to what the aim originally was. And people go, yeah, you're right. They start saying the degree of success that we have been experiencing based upon the amount of energy put into it, based upon the admirable goals stated for this activity, we're missing the mark, folks. I mean, people say, you're right. And they'll even begin to lay blame. It's the bureaucrats. It's the people who are out of date. We got to do something. If it's going to continue, it goes from apparently a whole lot of backbiting, a whole lot of bad comparisons, a whole lot of resistance, that then it begins to produce new ideas. Well, all right, well, what should we do? A lot of people go for a while, I don't know, let's just attack, let's fire people, let's criticize more. But if it's going to continue, it turns into a form of expansion. It turns into finally a form of improvement. You didn't expect me to do that, did you? You didn't expect me to point that out. You didn't think I'd take it like that. I can give you another chi root. You really would never expect this, but I guess you can hear it tonight. A man that don't complain ain't got nothing constructive to say. Think about it. Nothing. Now, as a sub-ponder, you might wonder where that puts my kind of descriptive pictures of a real revolutionist, a new kind of consciousness, new kind of intelligence, by pointing out that a real revolutionist would not be critical. So where does that put that kind of thing? Think about that on your own time. Throughout history, I was not the first person. Throughout the history of man, you have had fairly ordinary people. All right, very ordinary people. In the line of history, making these statements in religious context, sociological, philosophical, making statements like, crude criticism accomplishes nothing. Other variations have been in more so-called spiritual ways, have been in all parts of this planet, all parts of life's body, different religions, cultures, races, variations of saying, well, a good man, a wise man, a spiritual man, an awakened man understands that life has to work itself out in certain ways, and therefore a real wise man does not go around finding fault with his fellow man. And that's up to the gods, that's up to fate. But a wise man, that's one of the signs of a wise man, is he doesn't go around kicking at people and picking on them. There are variations of that everywhere. But I just told you something that you didn't expect to hear. That is, a man, small m, including men and women, a man that don't complain ain't got nothing worthwhile to say. Nothing constructive. And any idea that a guy can make some comment, I don't care what kind of monastery he's been in, that he's been chanting for 14 years and he's lost 470 pounds through fasting, if he doesn't say something that's a complaint, then he is not saying anything worthwhile, because it will not lead at the city level, at any observable known level. There's no way it will lead into any worthwhile change. It will not lead into anything constructive unless the man is critical. I don't care who he is. Of course, you might also notice, those of you that need a hardwired or a hard existing example, religions. I started to say pull a fast one on you, but you're going to have to, but now, you guys will be getting good enough to see it's not religion. It's not even yourself. It's somebody else. I don't want to go into it. But that human nervous systems, these great intellects, will pursue, hold up the banner of some religion, some would-be mystical system of some kind, that just states outright, or take Christianity. That's one of the better known. Most of you have heard of that, hadn't you? It was, but that guy was in the paper just yesterday about that. At any rate, And it states over and over. And people preach sermons, they write books, and it spawns all these other little mom and dad operations all the way from this Christianity thing. About it's, don't judge your neighbor, and it's only up to the gods to judge, and don't go around sticking your finger in other people's eyes until you pick out the phlegm from your own eye and all that. They do all that and say, be like, Jesus? Be like Jesus that loved all the little people and the common people, and he never found fault. He defended pimps, well, I guess it was prostitutes. Never mind. Crude joke. But that he was the one who says, he without sin, let him cast the first stone. All that, and it all sounds like the same kind of thing that's true in Buddhism, Shintoism, Confucianism, and all isms. Somewhere in there, there's always this thing about don't be critical, and it's not up to you to decide. Like they say that, and they hold up Jesus, to use that religion, about, now there's a guy, stood in front of people, said, don't throw rocks at this poor sinner, unless you are without sin. And that all the people, according to Cecil B. DeMille, I think, they all went, all of them that had rocks and was wanting to, stone this woman or this guy, and he says, wait, let he who is without any sin cast the first stone, and they all go, well, and they drop their rocks and go, well, and they go off, see. They say that, but then look also, what I was trying to show you is how the human brain operates. Then all these remembered words and stories about this guy Jesus, except for these few little things about he who is without sin, what was the rest of the time he was doing? He was raising mortal hell with life and everybody else. I mean, if that was all you had to go on, I would not want to be locked up in the closet with somebody like him. I would have to spend the weekend out with him in a rowboat. It was bitch, 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 bitch. Think about it. And if you don't want to think about that, think about Muhammad. It was just almost non-stop bitching. Now I refer you, but notice they'll still say, all right, to follow this religion, not just Christianity, but to follow this religion, you must be peaceful. You must be non-judgmental. In fact, just look at our great leader. And if you can look at your leader, it's just what I'm telling you, it was none but a non-stop string, except every now and then. They say, well, he'd say things like, you people shouldn't bitch. And then he'd say, that's one of the things I hate about humanity, and the rest of it is you bitch all the time. The human nervous system can't see that. Of course, we're going to play triple subtle, is I have to do the same thing verbally, except I know what's going on. Because it sounds like, well, I'm pointing this out. I'm having to compare it with something to try to get you to see it. And everything suffers from comparison. Jesus was probably a sort of decent sort until I started comparing him with something. Because everything suffers by comparison, remember? You've already forgotten that. It doesn't matter what. It doesn't matter what you say. You can try to compliment something, and it's still going to suffer as soon as you compare it. Everything looks worse by comparison. And also remember, if you're trying to tie all this together, the first act's always the best. Because as soon as the first act's over, everybody starts comparing it. You know, another way. As soon as the human brain, as soon as ordinary intellect thinks about something, I don't care what, the first time you hear it, the first time you read it, the first time you think you thought of it, as soon as you have that thought and go, wow, or as soon as you read it and go, wow, what a thought I read, oh, immediately after that, you compare it. That is not the way it's described. It would have never been described that way. Psychology will never, at least in our lifetime, come up with anything resembling this. Because it is not labeled as such. It's not seen as such. It is still as subtle as me saying that there is a kind of adversarial arrangement built into being alive that is not identified. It's not seen as such. A kind of resistance is going on that is not overt resistance all the time. It is not something that can be seen, to say the least, readily by the old intellect. Much of it can't even be seen by the old intellect. It's just part of the glue of life, which you can notice in your own self. As soon as you think something, as soon as you greet something, as soon as you can identify something, as soon as somebody says, hey, have you ever heard of a Schlitzmobile? They're building them now in Spain. And you go, no. And the guy says, come around the corner. And he says, there's one. And he's been telling you how great it is. And you look and you go, wow. What? You know, it looks a little bit like, and there it goes. You know, that reminds me of, and there you went. it is suffering. It looks worse by comparison. Even if you did this, even if you say, wow, that looks better than a new Ferrari. Now, that sounds like a compliment, right? Wrong. Do you hear me? Because all you're saying is, compared to something else you like, a new Ferrari doesn't look all that good. The thing has suffered. It looks worse by comparison, by any kind of comparison. By any thoughts you ever had, as soon as you had the thought, just immediately, just as soon as that thought's over, the first thing you do is compare it. Except that is not what it's called. It's either that or you're not going to think anymore about the thought. That is, it is at that time a cul-de-sac. You just had the thought and it was like having a sneeze or a piece of pollen got in your eye and that's it. But if it's going anywhere else, as soon as you think the thought, as soon as you greet the thing, as soon as you identify it, as soon as it's identified for you, as soon as you confront it, even if it be with apparent glee, right after that, just immediately it'll be, and you compare it. And even if it apparently is a good comparison, the thing will look worse by comparison. Everything looks worse by comparison. Everything you think is based on comparison. Nobody follows that line at all? Well, hell, I know you don't want to. So we're talking about speech. Let me give you one connection, an expansion directly from last time we were meeting, and I was talking again about primary purposes and secondary sub-purposes, hobbies. Question: when/how does eating at the primary level, primary purpose level, when does eating, how does eating become a dining experience? Answer: when the intellect takes any primary purpose activity to the secondary level. That's when, that's how. When does procreation become love? When does shelter, that is, trying to keep yourself from being so cold that you have to go bye-bye with Elvis, when does it go from that to the hobby of being fashion conscious? That is, that you no longer dress to keep yourself from freezing to death, which is the primary purpose of clothing. When does it go to the secondary level, which is fine if you understand what it is, to where you're no longer dressing to stay warm. You're still dressing to stay warm in the same way that when you are now a gourmet, don't write me, when you're now gourmetting it up, and that's your hobby, is you do not simply eat to stay alive. You now subscribe to Gourmet magazine. You now read reviews, and you eat as a hobby for a dining experience. Now, the primary purpose is still served, that you do get fuel in your body to keep you alive another day. And so by wearing the latest Saint Laurent or whatever pullover, it will still keep you warm, but the reason you picked that out was in the same reason that you went to Senor Bubba's new restaurant to eat the new fare. It was to have a dining experience. The primary purpose was served in this instance as a secondary by wearing a Bill Blass pullover. It'll keep you warm, but now the primary purpose has become the secondary purpose in this one instance, because you bought this particular one to make a fashion statement, but it kept you warm also. When and how does all that take place? It always requires that you intellectually have taken the primary purpose to the secondary level. You want more? To do that, to think in such a way, to exercise the intellect, we've already been through some new descriptions tonight along a different path. To think about anything, you have got to compare it. You've got to compare why you want to have a Bill Blass pullover rather than a Silvertone from Sears. Why you want a Saint Laurent evening gown rather than a Craftsman from Sears or a Black & Decker. There has to be a comparison that I want this one. I want to eat at Bubba's Fine Foods as opposed to, you know, Burger Doodle. There has to be a comparison. And anytime there's a comparison, there's what? Remember, the thing that's being compared looks worse. Always. Comparison makes anything look worse. Anything you think about, you will resist at the ordinary level. Anything you think about at the ordinary level, you will criticize. If it went on long enough, if one human lifetime, if the collection of molecules making up what apparently is an individual, identifiable individual, went on long enough, you might be able to begin to complete a spiral to where you could go from criticism. Now this is very... Oh, all right. For your benefit, I'll say this is a very kind of theoretical discussion of how things might be in the city if things in the city were different. You understand? That is, if things went on long enough, one person might be able to go from the point of criticism and resistance and actually fulfill what the human nervous system has been driven to say all these thousands of years about, live and learn. There could be a punchline, I guess, in there, a smart aleck joke somewhere like, yeah, we could live and learn if most of us could live to be, maybe 1,200 years old. At the rate we're going, maybe I would live and learn if I could live that long. That is where I was hinting that there could be some validity if things in the city began to either operate at a different tempo, that is, that humans live longer, or at the time which you do live, the speed at which the life's nervous system is moving increased itself. That it could go from criticism to resistance to actual improvement. Which it does, but it's not based upon one individual's lifetime. It's based on a collection of overlaps. And that things do make progress, things do change. That it apparently was in one lifetime that the practical use of electricity came to be. It was in a lifetime of somebody there, but it was not based upon the lifetime of a person. Do you understand? It overlaps to such a point that you may live through, or you could see, if you want to call, which you should admit, well, if you looked at the use of atomic energy for peaceful purposes as being a boon, let's just say, forget any of the ramifications, most of you lived there in the time, but it was not due to the lifetime of one individual. It was not that one individual went from criticizing the use of fossil fuels or the inefficiency of fossil fuels and had a dream and resisted what was going on then and then fulfilled the dream. Now, it does not belie the fact that I know there are people like, you can give Thomas Edison credit, that in one lifetime he brought about at least some of the practical uses of electricity. Or that you could say Teller or somebody almost single-handedly brought in atomic energy from destructive purposes, at least showing how it could be used for peaceful purposes. I know all that, but you're missing the point. One person does not think, one person does not live out the full spiral that they resisted something. That is, they criticized the way things were done, whether it be in the scientific, the intellectual, the spiritual community. No, I don't like that. That is wrong. That is dumb. Because, of course, anytime you compare it, it's already suffering. It does not go from that to the person being able to know what they're doing, to take it from criticism, and then to expand the criticism to the point that now we've got potential ways to make it better. It happens. But the people involved do not know it happens. They do not know what it is. They are not willfully, knowingly, a participant of it. Can you see in a certain way that the ordinary workings of old intellect equals secondary purposes? The intellect itself equates to hobbies. The intellect itself equates to those kinds of activities that seem to keep most people sane and sober enough to stay in the queue line, to stay in the slaughter queue. But you can see that there are no hobbies, there are no secondary purposes, there are no secondary uses of anything without the intellect. If you cannot think about it, you can't make it a hobby. If you couldn't think about sex, there would be no Playboy, there'd be no pornography. If you could not think about food, there would be no restaurants. There would be no more gourmet magazines. There would be no restaurant reviews. If you could not think about it, everybody would still be wearing skins Everybody be wearing the cheapest clothes you get your hands on. If you could not think about clothes, there would be no fashion industry. Now, if you couldn't think about it, would there be a you? I started to do one of my dramatic finishes and cut the tape right there, but you should be able to see without any sort of extremely rococo thinking that no, you would not be you if you could not think about you. And if you can get a little more rococo, you could not be you if you could not think, period. Now, since I said that the intellect in a very specific way equates secondary purposes, turning primary purposes into hobbies, does that give anybody any sort of chilling hint as to what the so-called human individuality amounts to? It's a secondary use of some primary purpose. And remember, since that is what you think about that makes you you, that makes you even aware that you're you, then you got to remember this, or you should try, that everything suffers by comparison. And so anytime you think about you, you're comparing you, and everything suffers by comparison. Every time you think about you, you suffer from it. Some of it I can put fairly succinctly, directly in words. This is not always the limits of it, but in many ways I could say that many people, that every time they think about themselves, they feel worse about themselves. Now, that's one of the cruder ways of putting it. It is still valid. But to make it a little more subtle, a little more complex, is what I just said, is every time you think about yourself, you suffer by comparison. Because everything is worse by comparison. And every time you think about you, the only way you can think about anything is through comparison. And I'll repeat again, although the human nervous system does not believe, it does not strike believe, it does not think in such a way that it is comparing what it thinks with something else. But now, 25, 30 minutes ago, some of you had it there for a second, that you could not think about anything without comparison. So you're not exempt from that. You cannot think about you. You cannot think about what you think without comparison. Not that you are aware that you're comparing, but you are comparing, or you could not think about anything. So when you think about you, you're comparing. And all things look worse by comparison. But a man that don't complain ain't got nothing worthwhile to say. You think I should have stopped the tape when we were ahead? Or do you think I should end on a more direct note and say, of course you're laughing, what should have been said, what I was going to say, the final version, is do you think that we should have quit while you thought you were ahead? Sure, why not?